Hi, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Reimagining Care with Capital Cardiology. We are just opening up the webinar right now, so thanks for your patience. We're going to wait as we see attendees rolling in. So we're going to wait just a couple minutes before we actually begin. So thank you. Thanks everybody who's hopped on for today's webinar. We are going to wait just another minute, and then we will get started at about 1:02 Eastern. We will kick off. We just want to give some other folks a chance to log on. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I appreciate your patience as we have waited for some folks to log on. We expect to have some continue to log on over the next few minutes. We are excited to bring you today's webinar, Reimagining Care with Capital Cardiology, and really Capital Cardiology's experience in scaling virtual engagement and clinical impact with their partner, HealthSnap. And so, the hardest part of cardiovascular care is what we all call the care in between. So what happens in between visits, and how are we continuing to monitor our patients, and how are we continuing to meet their needs and coach them and make sure that not only are their numbers staying in a desirable range or moving towards a desirable range, but our communication and guidance and coaching and counseling with the patients as well. And obviously, this is not something that physicians have the time to do in between every visit. And so the team that is required to put that together, the technology-enabled services to put that together, and how to do that well inside of a cardiovascular program is the story we're going to hear today. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to really further communicate how you can communicate with the team today if you need anything. If you would like to access the slides, you can do that through the chat function. And you will see throughout today's webinar, as new people join, we will repost the slides. It will always be the same slide deck. So if you download it once, you don't really need to go back out to the chat box again. That chat box is not how you would communicate today with other participants on the webinar or with the team hosting the webinar. To communicate with us, whether there's a technology issue, or if you have a question for one of the speakers, which we're sure you will, then you can do that through the Q&A button at the lower right center of your screen. And then we will have those questions come in, and we will work on those questions and answering those questions after about the first 15 minutes or so of the webinar. So just have some patience as we do that. So I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have with us today. Our first speaker will be Patty Dixon. She's the Director of Operations at Capital Cardiology. We also have Samson Majid, who is the CEO of HealthSnap, as well as Dr. Wesley Smith, who is also the co-founder and the Chief Scientific Officer of HealthSnap. So we've brought together folks who really know how to share the story with you, share their expertise on how this type of care is delivered, and their firsthand experience. So thank you all for being here. We're thrilled. And what I'd like to do is turn it right over to you, Patty, to take us away. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and MedAxiom, for giving me the opportunity to speak about a program that I'm very passionate about. As Joe said, I am the Director of Capital Cardiology, where we've been caring for hearts in the capital region of upstate New York for over 30 years. We're a physician-led team grounded in clinical experience, excellence, innovation, and compassion. And now we're proud to extend that care beyond the clinical and into patients' daily lives, well, where real health happens. So how are we doing that? Let's talk about the goals behind these at-home programs. So the goal for our at-home program is simple: improve outcomes, deepen engagement, and cut unnecessary cost. By using technology to monitor patients remotely, we can detect problems early and act quickly, keeping people out of the hospital and in better health. We're doing this through three key programs. Remote patient monitoring, or RPM, collects and transmits real-time health data like blood pressure and weight, so care teams can track progress and respond quickly. Principal care management focuses on managed care for patients with single serious chronic conditions, helping them stay on track with meds, appointments, and care plans. Chronic care management uses a broader approach that supports patients through ongoing coordination and support. Today, we're primarily focused on remote patient monitoring and principal care management. The two programs, we're seeing the biggest impact and provider engagement. So let's take a look at one of the core tools that helps us do this, remote patient monitoring. So remote patient monitoring is the bridge between visits. We're able to see real-time data for our patients like blood pressure, weight, and glucose right from their homes. It means less guessing and more reacting in real time and a much stronger safety net. But in addition to tracking numbers, we also need coordinated care. And that's where principal care management comes in. So while RPM is tracking the numbers, principal care management is supporting the story behind them. It focuses on patients with a single complex condition, like heart failure, and it offers structured, ongoing support through medication checks, care plan updates, and clinical follow-ups. PCM is already a part of what many of you do, calling patients, following up with them, reviewing meds, coordinating care. The program simply gives the work the structure, documentation, and reimbursement. So with CPT codes that are designed for both the provider and the staff time, it's a scalable model for proactive care. And importantly, PCM and RPM work wonderfully together. RPM is going to give us the real-time data, and PCM is going to give us the framework to act on it. The result is a more complete, coordinated approach to care. So what does that look like for us? Right now, we have about 7,000 active programs between remote patient monitoring and principal care management, a strong indicator of both patient engagement and operational commitment. And what's even more encouraging to this is the level of provider participation, with over 30 of our clinicians actively supporting these efforts. It tells me that we've built something scalable, sustainable, and valuable, not only for our patients, but also for our providers and our care teams. These numbers reflect a system that works, one that's ready to evolve with the future of healthcare. But how we make this work starts with a strong foundation. Next slide. Launching a successful program starts with clarity. Why are we doing this? What outcomes are we chasing? Success hinges on building a strong foundation, and that means choosing the right partner who understands your goals, provides hands-on support, and becomes the extension of your team. IT must be reliable and integrated because when technology is working well, it allows staff to focus on the care. Getting provider buy-in is also critical, not just in theory, but in workflow. We need to make it easy for our clinicians to engage. And last but not least, patient education ensures long-term success. When patients understand the why behind the program, they stay engaged and become true partners in their own health. So right now I want to shift to one of our innovative programs within care management called our metabolic clinic. It's exciting and fast growing, where we're combining evidence-based medication management with remote and principal care management to support weight loss and improve cardiovascular health. Patients are referred to our clinical pharmacy team for assessment and initiation of GLP-1 therapy, which has shown powerful results in reducing body weight, A1C, and cardiovascular risk. We currently have over 1,800 patients enrolled in this weight loss pathway, and we have over 500 more awaiting initial evaluation. To me, that is a clear sign of the need and the patient interest. Our pharmacy team ensures safe, effective dosing and close monitoring, while RPM allows us to track meaningful metrics like blood pressure, heart rate, and weight. This integrated approach allows us to intervene early if there are concerns and adjust therapy based on real-world results. This is more than a weight loss program. It's a cardiovascular disease prevention strategy. It's chronic care reimagined, and it's a blueprint for how specialty practices can drive meaningful, measurable change in population health. And we're seeing real-world outcomes from these efforts. So let's take a look at that. Next slide. This slide focuses in on patients who have been enrolled for at least 90 days, and they are actively engaged, meaning that they're transmitting their health data at least half the time. These are the patients we can truly make a difference with, the ones consistently participating and giving us meaningful data to act on. And as we took a deeper look at the clinical outcomes comparing the first 7 days of blood pressure readings to the most recent 7 days, the results were powerful. Patients saw on average a 14-point drop in systolic and just under an 8-point drop in diastolic blood pressure. This kind of improvement is exactly what we want to see. It gives hard data to justify the program's impact and reinforce its clinical value. It reassures our team and our providers that these programs are working. They're producing measurable health improvements. Next slide. With this slide, 67% of the patients exited stage 2 hypertension. This shows real sustained impact over a 7-month average. Of those 67%, 32% reached controlled blood pressure range, 34% improved to stage 1 hypertension, and the remaining that stayed in stage 2, we have opportunity for clinical interventions or reassessments of adherence, medication, and care plans. These outcomes reinforce the value of RPM in care management in improving the chronic conditions like hypertension. And demonstrating these ongoing monitoring and team-based care can drive significant improvements even in high-risk populations. This data is useful when justifying continued investment in the program or discussing its impact with payers, providers, and leadership. Principal care management is where we manage those high-risk, single-condition patients, usually like heart failure. The biggest win? Patients feel more supported. They know someone is checking in and coordinating their care. This slide shows that with proper workflows and provider buy-in, engagement doesn't have to fall on the physicians alone. Our staff are empowered to take a big role here. It's scalable, sustainable, and patients are sticking with it. It creates a sense of connection, and it reinforces daily health behaviors with a digital nudge. So as far as the alerts are concerned, patients that have escalated alerts, a call comes into the care navigators. The care navigators evaluate the situation through algorithms, and if the escalation needs to be brought forward to the providers, it comes through our electronic system. This allows the staff to work to their highest level of credentialing. It allows the providers to be involved when necessary, and it keeps the program moving efficiently. So this program of taking care to the home, it's working, it's happening, no matter where the patients are. Thank you.
Patty, thanks so much for that and for kind of sharing your story and your experience at Capital Cardiology. And I appreciate you sharing a lot of the data with us as well, at least in terms of hypertension and kind of where your patients are falling demographically. And I appreciate that. This is really insightful. And I would like to come back to some of that, but I also want to have an opportunity to bring Samson and Dr. Smith into the conversation as well. And one of the things that I hear it constantly is a lot of unsurety around what it means to get into a program like this, what that means for the practice, things that they fear they may not have the capabilities or the capacities to do it. And some folks who say, well, but we know of a buddy who tried this, it didn't work, but they used a homegrown solution. There's so many things that I hear, but I know that from the Health Snap team, you guys are doing this every single day. And so I'm kind of curious about what things you're hearing out there in the space when you talk to people about this level of, PCM and CCM and RPM. Like, what are the misconceptions that you're getting from people about starting these programs that you're just kind of hearing constantly? And then I also kind of want to know, what is the response to that? So what are you hearing, and is it truth? Is there still major challenges, or do people maybe are not implementing things in an appropriate manner? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I'll go ahead and take a first stab at that. So thank you all again for taking the time this afternoon. And Patty, thank you for the comprehensive and thorough overview. As a quick reminder, my name is Samson. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of HealthSnap, and we've been partnering with organizations like Capital Cardiology for the last decade. We've successfully started and scaled over 150 health system and physician group remote patient monitoring, chronic care management, principal care management programs. And in those 10 years, we've remotely monitored and managed over 100,000 chronic patients in their homes. So we have a breadth of experience when it comes to starting and scaling these programs successfully. And we've learned a lot along our journey in these partnerships. And it's only because of our partners like Capital Cardiology that we continue to innovate and get better in pursuit of the best patient care. So let me take a step back and just outline what I feel like are some of the biggest misconceptions and where fear, uncertainty, doubt comes into play with these types of programs. Number one, and I think we hear this most consistently, is this going to disrupt my clinician workflow? My providers have very little time. We're already short-staffed. How are we going to actually do this in any meaningful scale when it comes to our practice actually servicing these patients? The second misconception is, will this actually be sustainable? How do we create an aligned business arrangement that creates sustainability, and what's the reimbursement risk over time when it comes to these programs? That then feeds into compliance risk. How do we do this in a compliant manner to ensure that, if there is an audit, that we're covered and all of our bases are properly accounted for when it comes to proper documentation, time tracking, especially if you've never done a program like this. You need to be able to, account for the appropriate CMS requirements when it comes to implementing these types of programs. That also feeds into just, I think, security in general. So making sure you're working with someone that has the appropriate security protocols in place and security frameworks. And then the last piece of this is, what's the patient experience going to be? Are we going to drive outcomes? Will this actually work clinically? And I think that's where a lot of provider groups and health systems that we work with, they're typically pitched more of the financial side, right? You get talked and you say, hey, there's the CPT code, you can make all this money, just go and do it. And I think a lot of practices did that in the last 4 years because they saw an opportunity. But in reality, the financial ROI of these types of programs is solely a byproduct of a very, very strong clinical ROI that's extremely integrated into existing workflows. And I think that's where a lot of practices run into challenges because they try to do this, they set and forget it, they outsource certain parts of it that maybe aren't accounted for, and they don't consider the clinical workflows and impact of their physicians when it comes to the day-to-day supervision of these types of programs. So those are the main, I think, misconceptions that we hear and challenges. And of course, we can certainly talk through where we feel like you need to emphasize to support each of those components. But I will emphasize again, there are really, really successful scaled programs like at Capital Cardiology that the patient demand cannot be higher. The patient experience, the provider experience, it's clear. And most importantly, we have proven clinical outcomes that are lowering the cost of care and lower utilization. And that is the quadruple aim. That is value-based care in its essence. And these programs are specifically designed by CMS to deliver value-based care at the population health level.
Wow.
Yeah, Joe, and if
So-
I could, I'll chime in on the tail end of that, and for the sake of time, just quickly address some of the assumptions too on the clinical outcome side. As a co-founder and chief scientific officer, there are some questions we often receive related to, how is remote patient monitoring, let's say, of blood pressure different than having a patient at home using their own manual cuff? And well, those studies have been done. There was published in 2017 a meta-analysis by Tucker in the Plus One journal. They looked at patients that monitored their blood pressure at home with their own cuff and kept a log of it. And they only saw about a 1-point systolic improvement among 7,000 hypertensive patients. When they added a co-intervention like lifestyle counseling, they saw a significant but underwhelming 3-point systolic improvement. We're seeing typically a 14-point improvement in uncontrolled hypertensive patients, and we're seeing an over 24-point reduction among stage 2 patients. And it speaks to the power of the RPM itself, and we feel that the data is driving clinical decisions. Capital Cardiology has done a phenomenal job using the data to adjust medications as needed. Patients mention anecdotally that they feel that there's a sense of accountability. They know their care team is monitoring them. They're getting feedback from the data on a regular basis. They're using that in sort of a metacognitive process to understand how lifestyle is affecting their measures. So they see that when they sleep better, or they change their diet, or they become more physically active, that they improve. And we also get some questions too about the alerts. So just to put in perspective, the scale in 2024, we had an average of 2 alerts that our clinical team responded to per minute. And a lot of times the question is this going to burden us with a lot more work on the side of the physician? And the physicians play a role, generally speaking, less than 1% of those. Most of those can be handled in-house, and we're identifying issues before they arise. So for example, just a few days ago, one of our care navigators, one of our licensed nurses that we use as care navigators, identified a concerning trend in body weight and blood pressure in a patient with heart failure and hypertension, reached out to the patient and learned that the patient's grip strength had gotten to a point where she couldn't open up her pill bottle. So that just took a simple call to the pharmacy to get a new pill bottle to address that concern. And of course, the physician didn't have to be involved in that. But just an example of how the remote monitoring the patients can really make a big difference.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. So thank you for that additional context. I want to circle back, Patty, when we talk about some of those kind of little successes and some insights there shared by Dr. Smith. You mentioned you've about 7,000 patients. So this is not new to you. You're not working with 300 patients. You've been through this a lot. So what I'm curious about is now you have a good basis of feedback. And what are you hearing from patients in terms of how it's changing their behavior, or how they feel more cared for by the practice, how much closer they've gotten, reductions in leakage? I'm just curious about that whole patient experience and what you guys have learned from that and how it might have changed what you're doing.
Like all practices, we are extremely, extremely busy. So patients might have a hard time getting an appointment. Patients might not get a call back if they're calling our office directly. And using a program like this, the care navigators as an extension of our team are establishing that relationship with the patient as an extension of Capital Cardiology. It's the same care navigator that's calling the same group of patients, so they get to know them very well. And patients are so appreciative of that. Patients don't want to be on all their medications. Patients want to see the results as well. And by doing this and being able to provide them the data and show them the goals that they've achieved, it helps them remain engaged, feel seen, and in between the visits, it creates just incredible patient satisfaction.
Yeah. I've heard from everybody that has done this well, and believe me, there's not a lot of people that have figured out how to do this well. A lot of people have tried, but when you do it well, the connection with the patient strengthens, and it's not just about the financial outcomes or even the clinical outcomes, but their relatedness and their kind of adherence across other parts of their care journey tend to improve because they feel more connected because they're constantly touching the practice.
Mhm.
That's what I've heard, and it sounds like you're seeing the same.
Exactly. And just to just comment on practices who may feel like they're not doing it well, I can't reiterate enough that partnership is so important. Having that partnership with the right company that is working right along the side of you, getting on calls with you day to day, working through compliance to make sure that everything is where it needs to be, sharing ideas, suggestions, that is what makes the program. And I feel like that has contributed hugely to our success.
That is awesome to hear. If I can, I want to come back slightly on a little bit more of the clinical side. And I don't know if this is for you, Samson, or for you, Dr. Smith. Either way, but you brought up alerts earlier, and I'm kind of curious about how many of those alerts actually need to be dealt with. At what point do you say, wow, we need to get a human on this? Is it, one out of range or significantly out of range, or a series that are out of range where you start saying, hey, we need to actually begin to focus on this patient? And so, what does that look like? Because some people are afraid that there's so many alerts that it becomes overwhelming, right? So how do you narrow down and focus on the right alerts? And then how does your care team kind of triage that, or, make sure that the practice is only getting really what needs to be seen? How does that look like in your world?
Wes, if I could start off with just, I think, fundamental design, and then I'll let you go into more of the scientific and the data side of that. First of all, before even getting into the actual, like, how many alerts get escalated to the team, I just want to take a step back on this conversation because it's extremely important. Number one, it's all in the operational design during implementation, and we are meeting regularly to define the algorithmic workflows in the clinical integration based on the acuity of the actual alert itself. So to us, alerts are not binary. Yes, no, blood pressure went above a number, it triggers, it gets escalated. It's actually set up in a way that we have the ability to, in a flexible way, enable Capital Cardiology and Patty's team to denote this specific alert is low acuity. This one is moderate. This one is high. This one is critical, and actually create that customizability in implementation. Not only can we create that flexibility and acuity, but now we can apply that to the type of alerts that are created. So in our technology and our virtual care management platform, you can create, if a blood pressure goes above a reading, then it triggers an alert, and I want to tag that as a low alert. If the 7-day average of systolic is above 160, then I want to denote that as a moderate alert. Let's say provider A wants that alert to be denoted as moderate. Provider B wants it to be high because they want to know if it's for their population differently. We can then adjust the alerts themselves based on acuity and then based on who they're assigned to within the actual clinical workflow as well. So now you can create alert routing protocols and alert acuity protocols based on binary changes, classification changes over time. For congestive heart failure, we have the ability to create set weights and change from a base set weight to be able to adjust there. So incorporating the clinical evidence into the clinical integration of these workflows is what creates long-term success. So that's number one and two, I think, in terms of just alerts overall. From there, then we're obviously iterating over time and getting feedback. And Wes, obviously, you can share more about, how these alerts and how many typically get sent over, but I just want to explicitly call out that typically there's a comprehensive care team that we're partnered with that is working this together, not usually the physician at the first line of review from the practice side. So that's always a concern. Oh, the physicians have no time, they can't review this. It is typically some APP team that's reviewing, a nurse team at the practice level that's denoted to supervise this program.
Yeah, I feel Samson has more than handled that question, but what I was just going to add is that just high level is that the program was designed not just to focus on clinical efficacy, but also to focus on reducing administrative burden. So all of the alert thresholds and things and the workflows that are put in place that Samson just mentioned are completely customizable by provider, by patient. Let's say you have a hypertensive patient that's secondary hypertension. So the threshold for that patient and where there's an alert initiated is different, of course, than it would be for a primary hypertensive patient. And that's an important part of reducing that admin burden. And like I said, a very small percent of the alerts actually have to get back to the provider, unless the provider wants to be more involved on the day-to-day. So they're usually, as Samson mentioned, members of the care team that will handle it. What I think is interesting is using the alerts, the thresholds, and then the longitudinal monitoring of a patient to look at, let's say, hypertensive alerts versus hypertensive alerts. We see things that are emerging, like new risk factors that have never been identified before, which is something remote monitoring allows us to do. For example, day-to-day variability. On the previous slide that showed the number of alerts through Capital Cardiology, you notice there are a lot of patients that triggered both low blood pressure alerts as well as high blood pressure alerts. And it turns out that day-to-day variability in systolic pressure appears to be an emerging and concerning risk factor that would never have been identified without the data science element of monitoring patients on a regular basis longitudinally like this. In 2024, we had 1.7 data transmissions per second. So with all that data, there's a lot of information that we're learning, a lot of predictive analytics that we're building around it. And it's a really exciting time for improving the care of patients through using the remote monitoring that we're engaged with.
Joe, one other thing I think just to call out on this topic too, because again, it's a very sensitive one. I think a lot of practices are concerned about it. We also have different technology that does things like false positive management. So if a patient takes a reading that triggers an alert, and then they take another reading within 10 minutes and it's in range, it will actually close that initial open alert. So it supports that false positive management. So that's like basic, just some simple things like on the technology side that can alleviate some of the admin burden that, Dr. Smith was referencing. And I think being able to do that at the population, provider, and patient level in the clinical workflows that we set up in implementation and iterate over time is why we're able to scale these programs to levels that Capital Cardiology has been able to achieve.
That is really helpful. I'm shocked at it never ceases to shock me at the amount of data that's getting transferred. You talk about, I'm going to round up two transmissions. I'm going to round your 1.7 to 2 transmissions a second. That's a lot of patients and a lot of data. Holy. It's shocking to me at how large this segment of the market has scaled, and you guys are really leading that. Let me then ask what it looks like to get to that point. So to go from not having an RPM, CCM, PCM program to the scale that you're at, I want to hear, and Patty, I'm going to ask you this one first. What is that process like? What are the challenges in that? What did you have to overcome? What lessons did you learn? Tell me what you think others would find beneficial about your journey and having to make that shift.
So it started by us taking a really deep dive into our patient population and looking at all the different disease processes, our CHF patients, our hypertensive patients, our diabetic patients. And then we were able to dig down a little bit deeper and look at, how many times these patients are calling, how many appointments are these patients having. Like, we did our internal thing to justify we need this program so that we can help our patients stay on point. But it really comes down to workflow. I mean, workflow is everything collectively across both HealthSnap and for ourselves. And it's extremely important to have the buy-in from the physicians. They need to understand that. And by sharing with them our outcomes data on a regular basis, and by the patient feedback, they're feeling very engaged and very optimistic about the program. And in all honesty, in the beginning, it's patient communication and education. Going back to that slide in the beginning of my presentation, we need the patients to understand why we're doing what we're doing. We're explaining it to them from the provider, from HealthSnap, from the clinical team here at Capital Cardiology, so that they can understand what's taking place.
Well, that's Samson. Thank you for that, Patty. That really resonates. Samson, what about from your implementations in cardiology? How do you think they become smooth? You've done multiple. I mean, so what does this look like specific to CV to make these kind of implementations go well?
Yeah, I think everything that Patty's talking about sounds easy in theory, but actually being able to do it and like refer to groups that have done it, like Capital Cardiology, is I think what kind of where rubber meets the road, number one. So I don't, when we talk about all this, it takes a lot of commitment, partnership, and talking about the right partners. We always say like we are here, we have a playbook, we know it works well, but it does take the physician groups that we partner with to commit to these partnerships and have the physician buy-in and have the leadership buy-in, as just table stakes to get started. So that's thing number one, is there has to be true executive commitment to these types of programs. Number two, we take an approach where we're like the intel inside and we're powering the programs under the umbrella of Capital Cardiology. So everything we do is fully white label. And I think that's really important when it comes to the patient experience, because they have decades of trusted relationships with the physicians and the care teams at Capital Cardiology. They don't know HealthSnap. So if our nurses called and said, "Hey, Patty, this is a nurse calling on behalf of HealthSnap," you don't really know who that is. And you kind of go, okay, this is a scam, or, and you'll have very little patient adoption. But if I said, "Hey, Patty, this is Samson calling on behalf of Dr. Sullenberger from Capital Cardiology," all of a sudden now that patient's going to go, "Oh, I know what this is. The physician's bought in. They've communicated to me about it." We do things like branded letters to the patient's home to educate them about the benefits of the program. Our phone calls, when we call a patient, has branded caller ID on it, and it says Capital Cardiology on it. So the patients actually trust the program. Patty mentioned it earlier, but our clinical staff are dedicated to Capital Cardiology. They don't rotate partners of ours. They are an actual extension of their care team. They know their clinicians, they know their care teams, and they have dedicated patients assigned to them that they work with and build very long relationships with over time. And we're learning more about patients in the day-to-day than I think Capital Cardiology would have been able to do normally based on their current in-office workflows. And that level of cohesion and care coordination is where the patients all of a sudden get this concierge level care that they've never experienced before. And that's what creates the long-term adoption and success, one patient at a time. And so when the patients perceive that level of benefit, all of a sudden now it creates that kind of workflow and adoption long-term. They give the feedback to the physician. The physicians now are bought in. Then we share the clinical outcomes holistically. And all of a sudden the conversation goes from fear, risk, uncertainty, doubt to, "Oh, my patients love this. They're getting better. It's not disrupting my workflow. Where else can we bring this?" And all of a sudden now you have a scalable program to the level that we've been able to achieve with Capital Cardiology.
Wow. Yeah, I'm assuming that when you go into something like this, and I'm just going to ask you, Patty, was this a limited rollout, 3 docs, 5 docs, whatever, and then when you were able to get the results that Samson just talked about, did it then expand, or did you as a practice commit to saying 100% we're all going to be in from the get-go? Just my curiosity.
We always have our super users, even with our physicians, right? I like to roll out programs where I have a few physicians that I know are going to be engaged and an active part of the development of the program, so that we can work out any of the kinks and make sure that the efficiencies and everything is working as planned. And then we start adding everybody in. It just has more control to the rollout. And it's worked very well for us across multiple things.
Excellent. As we think about this, thank you. And that's just had to understand how this one was rolled out, because it has scaled so large already. You talked in your presentation, Patty, about outcomes, and you gave us again blood pressure measurements. But one of the promises of remote patient monitoring and chronic care management is earlier detection of decompensation, right? Which, if we do that, we can handle patients so we are avoiding admissions or readmissions. And so we're hoping that not only is there a fee-for-service component on the front end of those codes, but hopefully a more value-based model of decreasing, avoidable care. And so I'm curious, has that proven true in your instance? Have you guys, are you tracking? You didn't present them, so are you at least tracking those, or is the hospital or is that not something where you've evolved to yet? I
Yeah,
don't know.
we're still gathering that information, but truly I could probably state that we've had, at least a 28% reduction in overall total cost of care among our patients. But we also have here um, a program that's like an urgent cardiac walk-in. So we get a lot of patients that come in and we're able to get them enrolled and we're able to treat them from a cardiac standpoint right off the bat. So we're also decreasing a lot of cost and issues um, overall by this program, seeing those patients and working them up right away and getting them enrolled as soon as we can when we know they need it.
Yep.
Okay.
We've also had two studies that we've submitted for presentation in American Heart Association on utilization.
Yeah.
Two different studies, and both were right, as Patty mentioned, a similar total cost of care reduction. One was 26%, the other was 31%. And the one study was a longitudinal study. So we actually looked at total cost of care and utilization among about 600 patients for a year before the RPM program. And then we followed them for a year after they started the RPM program. So it was really an apples to apples comparison. I mean, we're using the same patients. We saw in this pretty high acuity group, they had hypertension and diabetes, but we saw a nearly $12,000 annual reduction in total cost of care on average for the patients, so $1,000 a month, mainly driven by fewer readmissions, fewer ER visits, fewer hospitalizations. We also saw an uptick in preventive screenings. There was a second study done where it was a cross-sectional ACO control group study where the patients were matched using what's called propensity score matching. Lower acuity group, but still saw a 26% reduction in total cost of care driven by the same factors. So of course, we're obviously very excited about that because to monitor a patient, relatively speaking, is very inexpensive. You can monitor a patient for 50 years approximately for the cost of one ambulance ride and a few days in the hospital. So we know this drives down cost of care. It increases preventive screenings and reduces utilization. So it's doing all the things with these types of outcomes that you would expect.
Wow.
And also just patients feeling supported between visits is really helping us to close our gaps in care, especially around medication adjustments. So they're not waiting months till their next appointment, So that's also been very valuable for us.
Wow. I'm curious. I don't expect an answer, but it seems to me that you guys would have a really good model for payers and others and under a value-based care model and to go at risk. I'm not asking that. You definitely have given me some numbers here that are very impressive and would attract payer attention and ACO attention for sure. So that is phenomenal. Anything else, Dr. Smith, that, I appreciate your comments there that you would want to add in terms of achieving some of those changes, by tracking patients, whether it's medication adjustments or not, and in some of the other readmission reduction areas that you've seen. What do you think not what do you think, but what is your postulate about how we are driving that level of change, when people are using Health Snap like Capital Cardiology? Any other clinical insights there?
Yeah, that's a great question because oftentimes we get asked, what is the mechanism of these improvements?
Yeah.
Because it's important to keep in mind when you see these really highly significant medicinal improvements in metrics like blood sugar and blood pressure, these patients aren't being initiated in an RPM program at the same time of starting a new medication. The vast majority, if not all of them, have been treated conventionally for approximately a year, presumably all on medications before adding the program. So to be honest, as a co-founder of the company, when we began this, we expected it to help with the management of conditions, but we didn't expect to see this amount of clinical efficacy, honestly. It's beyond what we hypothesized. So of course, we look at what are some of the mechanisms, and we even talk to patients directly and survey them. And we hear one of the things is, we see the data driving clinical decisions, as I mentioned earlier. Capital Cardiology is phenomenal with that, which is why they started seeing better outcomes right at the beginning. But the other part are the patients speaking to, they don't use this terminology, but increased self-efficacy. They really learn that they can take control of their condition because the regular monitoring and the data that changes over time with their lifestyle change and their care plan, they get feedback on that. They're starting to learn that when they sleep better, when they change their diet, that it has these effects. They see the importance of medication compliance. But we also had some interesting insights where we looked at 10,000 patients that took a leave of absence from the RPM program for at least 60 days. And we wanted to see when they returned what had happened. And what we found is that they actually started to go, these were hypertensive patients. They improved significantly on the program like we typically see. But then after the 60-day leave of absence and they came back to the program, they actually had recapitulated back to their earlier hypertensive values. This is another presentation that we have that we submitted to AHA because it was, we wanted to see is the improvement after being on the program, is it sustained, or is this instead of being episodic, is this something that should be sort of long-term management of the patient? Well, in this case, it was really interesting to see that without the program, they started to fall back. And when we placed them back on the program, their improvements continued along the earlier trend.
Wow.
So those are some interesting insights as to how this is really, it works almost like a medicine, like a standalone treatment.
Yeah. Well, it's a powerful one, that's for sure. So what I'd like to do is actually just tell the audience now, everybody, the Q&A box, which is, again, I believe at the lower right center of your screen, is certainly open for you to ask any questions of our presenters today. I do have one that I think's been sitting in there for a little while, as my guess, based on our discussion earlier. So thank you for your patience in that. But I would like to ask that one now and encourage anybody else to please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A feature in Zoom meeting here. This one I believe was directed at you, Patty, and it's how did you get your team excited to use remote patient monitoring? We are experiencing a little pushback in our practice. Any tips?
So I feel that we've alleviated some of the work for our staff because HealthSnap team is taking on a lot of that initial work for us. And what's coming to us are things that truly need our attention. So it's decreasing calls, it's decreasing our, we call them tasks, our work lists within our system, because we're getting what we truly need. And patients now know that been enrolled, that they're going to call the number that's going to get them to HealthSnap if that's the program they're enrolled in. So they know the steps to take.
Okay. Well, that is there any groups that you did have pushback from, specifically APPs, nurses, physicians in the beginning that you had to overcome, or?
I think that physician buy-in is probably one of the hardest things. You always have the naysayers. They don't have time to talk about the program with the patient, or patients aren't going to want to do it because they don't want to have the co-pays, things like that. But I think after continuous education across all levels and explaining it, and now that we've been doing it for, just over a year, everybody's really seeing the benefits of it. So, like with any group or anything you start, there's always going to be people who think that it's going to add work, but you just move along and do the best you can, and you pivot and adjust as needed. And you continue to communicate with the partners and the patients. And if you believe in it, it's going to work.
Well, it's obvious that you've gotten the growth, the buy-in, the patient volume, and then the clinical impact. So, I mean, it's obvious that if you had naysayers, you've overcome a lot of that.
Yeah.
I want to ask. Well, that's not better what I would ask. Let me take a look, see if any questions have come in. Please, anybody, feel free to use the Q&A button again to ask questions at the bottom. There is, and I had a question, but I'm going to default to the one that's here instead. This is for, I think it would be for Samson or Dr. Smith, either way. But what is the thing that practices get wrong when picking an RPM partner? And how can they make sure that the tech actually works for their team's daily workload? So either of you on the HealthSnap side, you see a lot of practices that have, probably converted from another solution or a homegrown solution to you. What do people get wrong, and how can they make sure it works for them up front?
I am a native New Yorker turned South Floridian, but I have heard the phrase over the last 10 years to make pretend like you're from Missouri, the show me state. And I think that's extremely important because there's a lot of companies that are offering RPM and CCM and PCM, and they are saying they can do a lot of functionality and drive the scale and have the outcomes. But we will always be the first ones to say, don't hear it from us, hear it from our partners. Here's the data and here's the references, and you talk to them about their experience. And I think that's extremely, extremely important. Everything from the clinical evidence to the ability to scale to the patient and provider experience to the electronic health record integration capabilities. I think that's largely oversold in our space. When someone says, oh, we have Athena, can you integrate with Athena? And the answer is yes. Please, please, please ask the second, third, and fourth question. What are the interfaces? Can I talk to a reference that has a live interface? How long does it take? Who's paying for what? Because those are not binary yes, no. Same with Epic or Cerner or whatever everyone's on in your ambulatory sites. I think that's a really huge component that supports scale that a lot of companies say they can do it, but either have not done it before or haven't done it in a way that's actually scalable and clinically integrated. So that would be some of the highlights I would focus in on, but make sure it's a vetted solution, that they're proven established partners, that you have an aligned business model so it's sustainable long term. And on the business model piece, I will just throw this out there because a lot of, I think, companies talk about this, but it is not compliant to share in a % of reimbursement. I just want to say that out loud for everyone to hear. That is a compliance no. You cannot split a % of your fees from a reimbursement perspective. So just things like that I think can cause trouble down the road. But those are the main things that I think we typically see out in the market that we would recommend, provider groups to focus on.
Yeah, that is, first of all, thanks for the compliance tip.
You got it.
Question. That is big. The other piece of that is, I can't tell you how many times I hear people say, oh yeah, we integrate with Epic or Cerner or anything else. And they go, okay, great, we're good. And no, very few people, at least in the initial phases, ask any of those questions that you just mentioned. So that is great. I've got a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A box. So others, please feel free to send them through the Q&A box. This one may come in, maybe, I don't know if it's for Patty or Dr. Smith or both, but it would be, let's see here. How relevant is it for paid home caregivers assisting patients at home to be technically fluent with RPM? So I've now got people in the home, they're on a program, with HealthSnap potentially, and how fluent do they need to be with RPM? I don't know if you've experienced that, Patty or Samson or Dr. Smith, whichever one of you want to take that one.
Yeah, I could say that again, as a co-founder, we saw this company come out of really academia, and we didn't know a whole lot in the early over a decade ago about starting a business. And one of the assumptions we made that we were wrong with is the assumption that the patient would be willing to download an app and use all the technology that we were putting together at the time, because we figured out that we had to make it really straightforward and simple. These are cellular enabled devices already, and they already come with their batteries included. And essentially all that needs to be done from a technological point of the patient is to turn on the device and use it. Of course, on the implementation side, when the patient meets with their care navigator, they're told how to use it properly, how to get a proper blood pressure reading, for example. But in terms of using the device or from the technological ability of the patient, we've made it so that it is really easy to use and super simple. And without that, we would not have been able to scale to where we are today. So I think that's important, but I can understand when people hear remote patient monitoring and they hear all these data transmissions that are occurring per second, like the stat we threw out earlier, and alerts, everyone assumes there's a whole bunch of technological knowledge that needs to take place on behalf of the patient and the care team. But in reality, it's very, very simple to use, and that's one of the key things.
Yeah.
Is there any?
Sorry, Joe. Our patients do really well with the technology, and it was a little bit of a concern just for me thinking about my elderly family, and it's been very easy. But from a home care day-to-day thing, in my mind, I would think that understanding why they're on this program and what they need to do to remain compliant on the program, is important, like, why am I taking your blood sugar again? Or, the blood pressure and where is it going? Just having that background information from a operations standpoint is helpful.
Yeah. And to the extent, I don't know if the home, I don't know enough about the question to say, is it conflicting with what the home caregiver is doing, or are they going to have to really probably support the patient and data collection in any way? So if there's any follow-up to that, please, continue to ask. I've got one more that is in there, and it is about patient success stories. Are there any really positive patient success stories? Which, again, I think any of the three of you could answer that one. I'll look to you, Dr. Smith, from the clinical perspective, but I think, Patty, maybe you have something great from Capital Cardiology as well. Dr. Smith, do you have anything? Or?
One of my absolute favorite things, of the many things I love about HealthSnap since we started it, honestly, is we have a patient story channel where our clinical teams will just share stories that they experience on a regular basis with the patients. And what I like to do is generate like an AI summary of each week and try to single out like the top 5. And just looking at this past week, there was a patient that had repeated hospitalizations prior to the program. And now, after meeting with the care navigator, she was so thankful for having learned just some subtle changes in her lifestyle and her nutrition. She has had the longest period of time out of the hospital without a readmission. We had patients that were patients that have emotional issues that they're dealing with, like depression. And we know there's a lot of patients that are lonely, that they are depressed. It's really hard to get them to want to necessarily take the steps to help themselves when they're in that sort of state. But through the connection with another care navigator, it was mentioned that this patient feels revigorated and excited, has really enjoys the calls, and has since started exercising and saw significant improvements in their numbers and seen improvements both emotionally and spiritually that she attributed to the program. And that was just a really nice patient testimonial. So one of the things that we do for this is we make sure that the care navigators, they've gotten into this field for a reason. We know that they want to connect with patients, they want to help patients. So we make sure that they are also getting a lot out of it, that they really feel like they are doing the work that they got into this profession for, which was engaging with patients on a regular basis. We teach them to be we preach a guide to the on the side of the patient rather than a sage on a stage, telling the patient, here's what you need to do, but just figuring out how willing is this patient to change. And let's, even if it's super subtle, let's just add some things that can help them along their care plan journey to getting healthier. And with that approach, it's really been rewarding. And as I said, my favorite thing to do at the end of every day is just go to the patient story channel and see some of these really amazing testimonials.
What an amazing thing for your culture. I mean, the internal benefits of that are just huge to be sharing those. I mean, what a feel-good place to work.
Yeah, we also, from a culture standpoint, since you said that, and sorry to interrupt there, but you made me think of it. We're also tracking clinical outcomes by care navigator. So when we provide feedback to our clinical teams, we also share with them how they're doing in terms of patient outcomes. So they're not just hearing other metrics, but we find that that's also very important because they're getting rewarded for making their patients healthier, which of course is the way it should be.
Yeah. The operations of virtual healthcare companies that are delivering virtual care or are located virtually, and the communication mechanisms for sharing stories and successes are just so personally intriguing to me. And I think that those lessons can be carried over into normal cardiovascular, care delivery environments. But we've certainly had to get very specific about how we do those in virtual environments, and they're just meaningful to me. I love that. Patty, do you have any success story that you want to share? Feel free. If not, that's okay.
Yeah, I think some of the things that Dr. Smith has said are some of the things that we actually have heard almost verbatim, to be honest. The doctors love getting the praise from the patients on the program. And just a random side note, my brother lives out of town but comes in for cardiology appointments here, and he's involved in the program. And I saw him this week, and he was feeling really excited because they were going to be able to change his medicine a little bit and decrease it because he's doing so well. So
That is
that
awesome.
made me happy. I didn't.
And it hits home. And it hits home. I'm gonna ask Samson just if you have any other words to say, or anything, closing thoughts before we close out the webinar, because we've reached time. So
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of bases here, so I appreciate everyone taking the time. I will say that we work very closely, not only our organization, but we recently formed a remote monitoring leadership coalition, and we're actively lobbying and working with our government to continue to advance remote care management like RPM and CCM and PCM. And there's some really exciting changes happening at the policy level right now. So in terms of the government right now and all the changes with the reimbursement landscape, remote care management is an area that will become the standard of care in the next 2 to 3 years. And the organizations that are investing and implementing these solutions are going to be the ones that have the best patient adoption experience and loyalty, because I think the patients are starting to become a lot more engaged in their healthcare. And as generations continue to get that Medicare age eligibility for these programs, we'll see more and more of this as the standards of care. And we're really excited about that. And major kudos to Patty and her team on leading the way as a leader in the space.
yeah.
Thank you,
Well,
Sam.
thanks to all three of you. Thank you, Patty, Samson, Dr. Smith. Appreciate you sharing today. Thanks to all of you for joining. We look forward to seeing you again on a future webinar, and of course at the upcoming CBT meeting in Austin. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, we will be happy to route those to the HealthSnap team for you. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar and wish everybody a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you.